My name is Fred Robinson, and welcome to our series, Baked In: Systemic Racism Around and Within Us. Next week, we hope you will join us to hear Jesse Perez, Director of the Old Globe USD Shiley Graduate Acting Program, who will be addressing the topic, Systemic Racism in Theater. It is a pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jillian Tullis and her panel of experts on the subject of perspectives on racism and health. Dr. Tullis is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication Studies at USD. Her teaching and research interests are in health communication with a focus on death and dying and such topics as hospice team communication, tumor boards, spirituality, quality of life, and a good death. Her research has appeared in Health Communication, Qualitative Research in Medicine and Healthcare, Journal of Health Communication, Journal of Medicine and the Person, and Departures in Critical Qualitative Research. Her latest article is entitled Obamacare Bodies and People at Risk. Dr. Tullis teaches health communication, including spirituality, health, and communication, and on a graduate level, intercultural health communication. She has given talks at the Middle East Cancer Consortium in Istanbul and the Death Salon in Boston. At first, I thought that was a goth band, and is the editor of the Critical Interventions Forum of Departures in Critical Qualitative Research. Dr. Tullis, welcome. I leave you to introduce your panel.
Before I introduce our panelists and make some open remarks, I want to first acknowledge that the land that on which I am, at least where I am, and maybe if you're on campus or near campus, is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. And we want to pay respects to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. If you are interested, please, I just want to encourage you that there's an option that you can turn on live transcription. So if you would like to be able to see and maybe check out the subtitles, that's an option that's available for you. So you just need to enable that. Right. So discrimination, disparities in health, and the consequences of racism in a variety of contexts have received more attention in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and this past summer's Black Lives Matter protests. Some politicians have vowed to make combating systemic racism a top priority. In fact, on January 12th of this year, the San Diego County Board of Supervisors declared racism a public health crisis. Some believe this kind of social discourse and such declarations are necessary steps to address systemic and structural racism. The National Museum of African American History and Culture defines structural racism as, quote, an overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society. To explore structural or systemic racism in health, I have asked 3 of my colleagues from across campus to join me, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order and then drop their bios in the chat just for a little bit of speed, because I could say a lot about each one of them and their accomplishments. So we have Dr. Fuller, who's with the Hahn School of Nursing and Health Sciences. Dr. Fuller has practiced as a pediatric nurse, if I can get the words out, a nurse practitioner since 1983, and her research interests include the impact of socioeconomic disparities on child development. The outcomes of high-risk infants, including non-medical factors associated with outcomes. She's also working, I believe, on a longitudinal study too that maybe will come up today, I don't know. We also have Dr. Kristopher Hall, who is in the School of Leadership and Education Sciences, which we like to call SOLS here at USD. Prior to making the move to academia, Dr. Hall worked at Hudson County Child Abuse Prevention Center, providing individual and group counseling. Dr. Hall's research and teaching focuses on pre-service military populations, practical applications for relational cultural theory, and minority success in the counseling field. And we also have Dr. Drew Talley, which, you know, we both have T last name, so I apologize for putting it at the end of the alphabet. I thought about being, you know, flipping it around for the sake of a fellow T, a last name T. But Dr. Talley is in environmental and ocean sciences, and his research focuses on elucidating the mechanics and generalities behind habitat linkages and integrating these connections into studies of coastal ecosystems. In the classroom, he integrates education and applied conservation biology into his fundamental science questions. And I promise you, he's going to help you understand the connection between systemic racism and the environment after his comments today. All right, so as you already know, my name is Jillian Tullis. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. So what we would like is for you to feel free at any time to place any comments or questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring them as we go, but we'll definitely try to leave some time, maybe at the end, maybe in the last 10 minutes or so, for other questions if you'd like to ask the panelists at that time. Okay, so my first question for the panelists this afternoon is, can you give us some examples of societal and or environmental inequities that affect physical and emotional health?
I think that it's very important that we all understand that societal inequities and socioeconomic status, constant exposure to racism. So we call them microaggressions, but they're not really micro, they're macroaggressions. People who are living in neighborhoods, which I know that Dr. Talley will talk more about, that have been redlined. We have neighborhoods that are food deserts without adequate food. People are facing a lot of factors that will influence their physical health. And we've known this for a long time based on observation, and we now have learned that the stresses and traumas associated with that actually impact the genetic makeup of a human being. And there are epigenetic changes to the telomeres. So we have a scientific basis that explains what we see, which are inequities in health outcomes.
And to continue that, it's important to remember that the body is a system. So we are dealing with emotional, psychological, and physical ramifications of all of these decisions that are made outside of our communities. And we have to then figure out how we're going to bounce back and be resilient as a result of, let's just say, constant attacks to the community in some way. So I definitely agree with Martha, and Drew is going to go into it a little bit more, that racism, low SES, and all of these other kind of outcomes of these issues are not by accident, they're by design. And the way that our bodies and minds respond to these things are also by design. So we have to start thinking about how we can unravel and be anti-racist in these practices so that our bodies and our minds can heal from what society is doing.
To follow up on that, I mean, I would say one of the things that's super important to sort of keep in mind as we talk today is just that past couple of decades, there have been literally thousands of studies on the benefits of being outdoors and being in nature, from things that are, you know, slightly less tangible, like how it increases people's self-esteem and reduces depression, to things like literally demonstrations that it lowers your blood pressure and increases your immune system. So it's that access to nature, that's one side of the coin. And for me, the other side is, again, coming back to what we'll talk more about in a bit, redlining and all. But, you know, Black people are, just as one of many horrifying statistics, are, I think it's 75% more likely to live near industrial facilities and like 50% more likely to live near a highway, which is bad enough to begin with, but then to blend in what like Martha was talking about with health effects, you know, Black kids get asthma at a rate that is twice that of white kids. And Black children die from asthma at a rate that's 10 times the rate of what happens to white kids. And so these are very real effects of something that sounds a little, oh, you don't have as much access to nature, or oh, you were put, in a bad area. Your house is is closer to the highway than someone else's. Those are really serious impediments to sort of having true justice and equality.
So you all have already said things that I want to ask about, but I can't ask them all at once. So let me go back to Martha for just a second. Can you talk a little bit more about this term that we use, that we've been hearing? I think some people have been hearing it now, maybe for the first time, this term health disparities, that, as you all have pointed out, this is not new, right? But what are some examples that you can think of that might help illustrate this concept or this phenomenon?
Well, health disparities, actually the World Health Organization has a definition for social factors that influence health, and it includes educational level, poverty, access to appropriate resources. I want to make sure I give all those: income, family and social support, community safety. So if, because of the racist structures of our environment, someone who is Black lives in an environment that has higher rates of crime, or they have been educated in schools that are poorer, therefore it's more difficult to get a higher level of education, and therefore overall their wealth is less. There's lots of research that talks about wealth, not income, but wealth, including owning a home where you are, that is protective for health. And so, although those of us in healthcare like to say, well, if you'd only exercise and eat right, you would be perfectly healthy. The truth is that only counts for 30% of health outcomes, whereas social factors, social determinants of health account for 40% of health outcomes. So it's actually more important than all the stuff that we still want you to do it, but all of those factors. So for me, that's what I think about, is that structurally speaking, I mean, having grown up as a child in Jim Crow South, I remember when schools were integrated and kids came who had had less appropriate education when we integrated my middle school. We had kids joining us who had not had the resources in their elementary school that we had had in ours. And so that was eye-opening at that point. I was a kid, I didn't know that it meant had a long-term consequence, or that would have a long-term consequence for health.
One of my questions, thinking about some of these gaps, and I don't know, Kristopher, do you have, or excuse me, Dr. Hall, do you have some, I should be more formal here. I'm acting like these are all my friends and I'm just having a little chit chat. So I apologize. Dr. Fuller, Dr. Hall, can you describe a little bit about some disparities and how they appear in the context of mental health?
So in the context of mental health, it's interesting because the body is in kind of constant fight or flight mode. And it's in fight mode more than it's in flight mode, because we've kind of started expecting that there's going to be some racism today. I don't know where it's going to come from. I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but there's going to be an aggression. And it's probably not going to be micro, it's going to be something. So the brain and the body adapts to that, and it deteriorates the body. It affects the mind, because this is where we start seeing anxiety, we start seeing depression. And sometimes, because our clinicians, and I'm working on this, aren't trained to understand race and racism as a potential trigger or a potential distressor, it gets missed. So instead, a client might be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, instead of someone saying, hey, well, what's your work environment like? What neighborhood do you live in? What do you have to walk through? What's your financial situation, and kind of why is that? What's your debt looking like? Because we also know that Black Americans have generally higher levels of student loan debt than other folks. So all of these things are racially based, and clinicians don't always think of these things. So it's not necessarily something that you can get rid of. Like, you can't get rid of systemic racism overnight, but if you don't check for it, you don't know that it's affecting that client in that particular way.
Mhm, mhm. So this leads me to one of another question that I have for everyone, because it's I think a direct extension of what Dr. Hall's talking about. So thinking about your respective disciplines, you know, the theme for this series is talking about how racism is baked in. And so how do you see racism being baked into your respective disciplines? What are kind of the and I also want to think about the history, right? Because I don't want to imply that some of these things are still happening today, but how do you see it already built into the system?
As a healthcare provider, I think it's built in several ways. One is, where can you get care and who is providing that care? So there are far more white physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners than there are Black or people of color. And so already, when you're going to see a healthcare provider, you may not be seeing someone who looks like you or has shared your experience. The location of healthcare facilities. It's really not a surprise that the nicest, newest, fanciest hospitals in San Diego County are all well north of Highway 8. I mean, we can see that. So where do you put your most beautiful, lovely institutions? You put them up where you think that the wealthier people live. And based on the history of San Diego, that ends up being primarily a Caucasian or white population. I think it's built in also because as we're educated, or we traditionally, as we were educated, we were all taught to believe that health outcomes were really individual responsibility, which is why it's so important to think about social determinants of health. Because if I think that the reason you've got this problem, and I've heard people say this about the COVID epidemic, well, look, those people are dying, those Black people are dying, those Hispanics are dying of COVID because they were obese or because they had high blood pressure. And it's blaming the victim, it's saying it's their fault that they had these health conditions. And there's a whole lot that goes into those diagnoses. And so I think we, as a, now that I'm in academia, we are trying to change how we educate the new generations of healthcare providers so that they understand the root causes of some of these conditions. I think also we don't know, if you haven't been treated badly, you don't know what it's like to be treated badly. I mean, I guess that I had an eye-opening experience once hearing, she didn't realize that I was hearing her. I heard my medical assistant greeting a Black family. And the difference in how she greeted them and gave them the forms to fill out when they were checking in was night and day from when she had greeted the patient who came before, who was white. And I thought, and I had never even thought about that would be another experience. No wonder they didn't want to come to our clinic. I mean, to my practice, if they weren't greeted nicely. I mean, it's just a basic thing. But.
Yeah, I mean, I would say another an important aspect of this is that it is just, like, baked in is such a great term for it, because it is in every ingredient in this racist loaf, to make a horrible, and I think I'll leave that analogy there. But what I mean is there are so many of these factors working, and even the most, so one of the examples that really strikes me is if you look at people in our national parks, about 2% of the visitors to US national parks are Black. So the vast majority are white people using these national parks. And there's a bunch of factors, kind of like all of these things. There's so many interwoven underlying factors causing that. Part of it is income disparity, right? If you don't have as much disposable income, it's tough for you to get up to Yosemite and stay there. Part of it is the amount of time off and childcare. There's a bunch of other sort of correlated factors. But one of the things that when I was investigating this, that I was surprised to learn, actually, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna share this one picture, if you don't mind, Jillian. I mean, Dr. Tullis, sorry. But that is not an accident. The National Park Service used to have specific Negro areas where if you were a Black person, you could stay at the Lewis Mountain National Park Service park, and you could stay at, you know, one of the bigger, better ones if you were white. And so there's all these different aspects to sort of what is causing this environmental racism and this lack of environmental justice. And it's every time you pull a thread, you know, it's leading to one other aspect that you know you might not have thought about. But I had no idea, and maybe I'm just naive, but it was only a few months ago I learned that there used to be separate national parks.
And I'm in the field of mental health, counseling specifically. And counseling is an offshoot of psychology. And the reason counseling came about was because we wanted to look at our clients in a more holistic view. However, a lot of our theories are rooted in psychology, and psychology was basically a bunch of white males. So we're at the point now where we are reassessing and reanalyzing a lot of those old theories because they've been tested and they work with certain diagnoses. But how do we take into account the cultural context of the client when we are applying these theories? And also new theories have been created as a result of these older models that were normed on non-POC. So you mentioned earlier, one of the lenses that I practice out of, relational cultural theory, it was created through a feminist lens by women and also with women of color included. So when I do my work, I'm already using a theory that includes that cultural context, that includes that understanding that there are different experiences that happen. And those different experiences are going to shape our worldview and flavor how we behave and how we see everyone. But if I'm using something like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which has only recently started to really include and understand cultural context, then it's really two different lenses. So in my classes, I have to constantly teach my students that, yes, we have all these theories and they work very well, but there's also this other layer that you have to make sure you're paying attention to, because if you don't, the application is going to be off, and then your client isn't going to get any help at all.
So one of my questions is kind of based on a question that came up in the chat, and I want to kind of tweak it a little bit from what the asker presented. I wonder if you think that one solution is to have more practitioners who look more like their patients. And if that's a yes, are there other strategies? Are there other things that can be done to kind of help with the gap that we're seeing and to help combat racism? Is that the only solution? Is to have a practitioner that looks like you?
I don't think that's the only solution, but I think that's part of the solution. Really to figure out how to recruit more people, more diverse people, particularly for more advanced roles. So there are a larger percentage of lower educated persons who are in healthcare who are persons of color. And the higher up the rung you go based on education, the fewer there are. But I think that's only part of it, because I think you can get good care from somebody who doesn't look like you if they are able to listen to what Dr. Hall was saying and think about what is the whole view, what are people experiencing, and look at it from a different lens, which requires a lot of education and support. And probably for those of us who are in and who are educating healthcare professionals, we're constantly needing to look at how we're doing it, what are we doing, and even things like what images do we show of skin conditions. So we're working with the library and have a trial of a new visual database, which has a specific hundreds of thousands of images of skin conditions on skin that is not white, because it looks different, and it's called Visual DX. It's something very expensive, but it's something that you have to make a commitment to. How do you educate your newly minted healthcare providers? But I think that there's a lot of threads we have to think about. It's the whole system. I mean, I'm laughing because somebody put in the title "Baked In" is perfect, and it really is, because you start to try to parse out where the racism is coming from, and you follow it down this rabbit hole and down this, and you realize there are multiple areas that we need to address.
I 100% agree. The racism is in the root. So it's basically at the bottom of the tree, and we're always trying to prune those pieces off because the tree is good, but we still need to take care of that base. And it's really a both and. So in counseling, we have conflicting studies about what we call mismatched dyads. And we found that in some cases, when we have mismatched dyads of race, the clients don't come back. The clients don't really make any progress. We found on the other end that with matched dyads, the same thing can happen. So for a lot of it, we do try and emphasize the relationship, but every client is so different in what their needs are that there needs to be enough so that anybody can find what they're looking for. So for example, if someone says, I'm going to feel better if I can find a Black female older therapist, that's who I feel like I can tell my secrets to, that needs to be available. Somebody needs to be able to fit that mold for the client. And if we have another client who says, you know what, I don't care who I see, I just need to see someone, that someone should also be trained to deal with Black clients so that they aren't creating aggressions in that counseling room. So we need to definitely work on diversifying the pipeline, which has gotten better in counseling, but it isn't quite there. And B, we need to ensure that the training that we're doing is training people to see that diverse client base.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying it, that it's both, right? Because I think sometimes what happens in the effort to increase diversity, it lets non-people of color off the hook. Well, I'll just refer you to the Black therapist, or I'll just refer you to, disabled, physician, that type of thing. And so I think it's important to hear kind of both of those perspectives. I appreciate that, and that the theory and the research also is driven by people of color, right? By diverse people as well. So I want to take us a little into talking a little bit about environmental racism, and also maybe Dr. Talley can also talk about redlining. So can you tell us a little bit about what environmental racism is?
Yeah, absolutely. So environmental racism is an idea that speaks to exactly what we were talking about earlier. The proximity, basically we're willing to build this toxic waste site or this factory in this neighborhood because it's full of Black and brown people, and so that's okay. And honestly, looking back to, as you said, to the redlining issue, I'm going to yet again share my screen for a second because I have an image here that I think is fairly powerful. So back in, sorry, you would think after all this teaching, I'd be just moving through this really fast. There we go. All right, can you guys see that okay? Just so one of the things that I think about a lot, because it's an ecological concept as well, so it's sort of, I inherited it early, is this idea of legacy effects, where something is the result of what happened before. And I wanted to talk about redlining because I found the redlining map for San Diego. So this was done in the 1930s. And this was a super common practice, and I am not an expert on this aspect of it at all, but this very common practice back then of creating what they called redlined areas, such as the red areas on this map. And those areas were considered, that basically you wouldn't pay much money for a building there. You would, it was essentially, it decided how much value that land had and then what sorts of uses it would get. So in this particular map, the yellow area, part of you can't see it very well here, but there's a second page that has the figure captions. This particular map said that the yellow area meant there's no immediate danger of Negro encroachment, but there is a heavy concentration of Negroes in the section adjoining. I mean, that is a horrifying thing to read at any time, but in this modern age. But these are decisions that were being made almost exclusively on the basis of how many Black people there were in this particular neighborhood. And one thing that I think is really interesting about the legacy of this is if you look at this diagram, right, we all recognize what some of these, right? City Heights is one of the red areas on here. The neighborhoods that to this day are underserved are the communities that are in red and yellow, and the cooler colors, the green and the blue, those are still the areas where it's Point Loma, it's La Jolla. So you're seeing legacy effects from this long, long after these redlining actions were first taken. And I have so much I could say about this, but one thing I want to throw in is just that, like, if you overlap, there is this idea called urban heat islands, which is that areas like a city with a lot of concrete tend to get and stay really hot. If you overlay a map of that red line map from the 30s, and we're coming up on 100 years later, 75, 80 years later, you overlay the map of what the temperatures are on average in different parts of the city, you'll see this huge correlation where the areas that were considered redlined because there were too many Black people are also the areas that are suffering the most from heat. And just to bring it back to climate change, as long as we're being depressing, the fact is, with climate change, heat issues are more critical and are happening more often. Black people tend to die at about twice the rate of white people from heat-related health causes, to bring it back to, sort of Dr. Foster's realm. And right, these things, so what we have is these areas where, from a decision made a century ago, we are now having people who are suffering heat stroke, who are dying more often, and they are getting in the areas that the temperature is rising the most rapidly.
I just want to jump in really quickly because he outlined it so well that, again, this is by design. So the reasoning was that we don't want to plant trees there because why? Look who lives there. And though that lack of trees creates a lack of shade. There's a book that I would love to recommend to y'all. I'm from Baltimore, so I've been reading about this a lot, and I'm always happy to hear Drew talk about it because it speaks to my heart. The Black Butterfly by Lawrence T. Brown, book that came out recently. He is a professor at Morgan State, and he really outlined that timeline of redlining back in the 20s. And actually, Baltimore was kind of one of the template cities for redlining, and people use Baltimore's template pretty much to extend across the United States. And he outlines how those same areas which he calls the black butterfly, are still over-policed, underfunded, under-resourced, environmental issues, health issues. Like, it didn't change even in all this time. And even personal examples of it, since if you look up, I know there's about 50 people in this room. If you go to Google Maps and you look at 407 Arnold Court, Baltimore, Maryland, that's where my father grew up. And if you look right next to it, there's Johns Hopkins Hospital. One of the most prominent hospitals in the United States is right next to what's basically the ghetto. And they've only just now started to turn it around because it's become profitable. So Johns Hopkins expanded, they started buying up land, and what are they doing? They're pushing all those people out. People that have been there for generations, people that have bought homes, lost homes, blighted areas, which the city let go into disrepair. Johns Hopkins is buying it and pushing everybody out. And this is firmly in the black butterfly, but it speaks to kind of that disparity of, you have more money than anybody else in this city. You could be doing so much for the people in the neighborhood that you're sitting in, and instead that money is going nowhere.
I have personally need to take a deep breath because this is I think as Dr. Talley said, I mean, it's rough, it's depressing, right? There's no way not to be frustrated and angry, and Johns Hopkins in particular has a long history of doing some inappropriate things as it relates to health and well-being of people, and yet it's my go-to for information about COVID, right? So yeah. So I hate to ask Dr. Hall to speak a little bit more. Will you talk to us a little bit about what this concept is, racial battle fatigue, that I learned about for the first time last semester during a Black Lives Matter class?
So the concept of racial battle fatigue was created by a critical race theorist. His name is Dr. William Smith. And his original study was looking at the experiences of Black men at a PWI, a predominantly white institution. And what he found was that basically they were experiencing racism constantly, and it was exhibiting itself in three particular areas. So the first one is psychological, second one is physiological, and the third one was behavioral. So it was changing the way they were acting, how they were feeling, and what they were thinking. And as more studies have been done, what they found is essentially these things are working in tandem all the time. So the brain is affecting the body, which is affecting the emotions, and they're showing up in very different ways. And there are ways that are very, very innocuous, but the way that counseling and psychology works is that one or two things don't really matter. It's when you start adding them up, and there's layers and layers of kind of stressors that are happening. So for example, if we're talking physiological, some of the symptoms could be frustration, defenselessness, agitation, constant worry, or hopelessness. And you look at those things, if you look at them separately, they don't really mean much. But when you look at them together and look at them in the context of a racist society, of course you're going to be experiencing these things. Of course you're going to be experiencing hopelessness about your particular situation if you see the government isn't really helping you, or you're being paid less than your counterparts, or you're going to experience some worry if the little bit of a job that I do have is constantly in danger because I live in an at-will state, or if I am constantly thinking about how I'm going to feed my children, or how I'm even going to get home because public transportation is bad, and public transportation is bad because they don't want to provide transportation to the white areas. It just compounds and compounds. And it's interesting because they've actually replicated these studies with other minority groups, and they found that it applies to them too. It just happens that with racial battle fatigue, it was done with them first.
I promise we're going to get to some actions and solutions here. I just want to ask if Dr. Fuller would talk a little bit about Black maternal health and also infant health. Could you just give us a little, I know you could probably talk about these topics for a long time, but would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
I'm happy to. Well, you've probably heard, it's been in the media, Black mothers are more likely to die during pregnancy, around childbirth, that time, than white women. And there can be multiple complications associated with pregnancy. We forget about it in the United States because we assume pregnancy is safe. And in fact, maternal mortality in the developing world is quite high. In the United States, it is significantly higher for African American and for Black mothers. And neonatal infant mortality rate is counted by 1,000, and 10.8 per 1,000 Black babies die, compared with 4.6 per 1,000 of white babies. We have research from our own state, from California, where they looked at quality of care indicators in neonatal intensive care units. And I think this was particularly painful because it's done by Dr. Joaquin Prophet and a variety of a consortium of people who are looking at how care is provided. And even within the same institution, a Black infant received fewer of the quality of care measures that we look at as healthcare providers than white infants. And so we have multiple instances of this. So why do Black mothers face more complications? Well, there are some underlying health conditions which may well be, we could probably trace them to much of the physiologic impact of constant stress. So as Dr. Hall was saying, this constant stress, it affects the body. The brain makes fight or flight hormones. The cortisone affects your body. It raises your blood pressure. Well, if you have high blood pressure for a really long time, it affects your kidneys, it affects your heart, it affects many parts of your body. And so we know that Black women have been affected by that. We also know that they're not listened to. And I think that one of the conditions that can happen, I believe it was when Serena Williams had her pulmonary embolism after pregnancy, she had to convince people what was happening. And so that's an issue with people discounting. We know that when we look at medicine or healthcare overall, women are believed less often than men in general, and Black women less so. So it is an ongoing problem in terms of our future. I don't know if that answered. I mean, there's lots of issues. There's a lot of literature on maternal mortality and infant mortality in the United States, and it's shameful. When we lived in Boston 30 years ago, it makes me think of, you're talking about Johns Hopkins, Dr. Hall, because in the shadow of Mass General Hospital in Roxbury, which was at that time one of the ghettos in Boston, and Roxbury and Dorchester, the infant mortality rates were triple that of in the white neighborhoods. In the city of Boston, literally in the shadow of these fabulous medical institutions. And so the city did a whole big grant proposal from the federal government to address that. But the fact is that here you have this disparity that is so obvious that needs to be addressed.
So I'm wondering, because we are getting, believe it or not, we're getting closer, we're getting to the end of our time. I'm wondering if there is any movement or action that makes you feel hopeful about our ability to dismantle racism in health. Does anybody have something that makes you say, okay, this is promising?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, one thing is when we taught the Black Lives Matter course, like just seeing all of those kids who are the next generation who are struggling with these issues and addressing them head on. I mean, that can't help but give you some optimism. But I would say the other thing is it's really easy to look at this how baked in it is, how systemic it is, and feel hopeless. Like, well, then it's everywhere. There's nothing I can do. But I would argue we could turn that on its head and say, yeah, but since it's everywhere, I can attack this problem in a million different ways. And everything I do is working towards that broader goal. So I think that's a useful way, right? We all try and be anti-racist every day in everything we do. But I also think it gives me hope that both that combination of seeing that next generation and recognizing, hey, I'm not going to view that as a downside. I'm going to see that as an opportunity for me to find a bunch of different ways to make the outdoors more accessible, to try to undo the effects of redlining, all of these things. So yeah, I do have optimism.
I do as well, because there's been a recent movement in the past several years, white coats for Black lives. And it's primarily our partners in the medical profession, but it's also in nursing, people taking a stand and people really trying to make changes. And so I think there are a lot of changes we need to make in our society, but being aware is one step. And that people are willing to take a stand and say we need to do something different is very encouraging to me.
This question is hard for me to answer because I'm a natural pessimist. Anybody that knows me knows this, but I have a lot of trust in individuals. I don't have much trust in systems, even though I've been getting more into understanding systems. And I will say, at least from the mental health side, that the stigma around mental health uh, in the Black community is starting to lift, and we are starting to get more involved in that system. So we are showing up. We want to be seen. We're talking about our experiences, and in talking about our experiences, that means we're no longer being silenced in the way that we used to. So that speaks to even some of my work where I make sure that experiences get put into academia. Because for me, once it's in academia, nobody can say it's a lie. You might say the research is flawed. You might say, well, I don't believe it. But once it's in a journal, people have a tendency of believing that it's a fact. So we are starting to influence systems. And in that influence of systems, we're changing the mindsets of those individuals and starting to get them more involved in mental health care, getting them the vocabulary of what their experiences are, and kind of pushing them towards therapy, which I am always okay with because I believe everybody should have one.
Okay, so we have a little bit less than 10 minutes left, and I think I promised at the beginning that we would open it up to more questions. So if folks have questions that you would like to ask any of our panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. I do have a question. I do community work, sitting on a few boards that touch on some of the issues that you all spoke to today. And I want to speak about one specific issue with, you just asked the question about, do people have, faith in the ability to change some of these issues that are so pervasive. And Mr. Hall spoke about how once something enters the academia space, then the issue has more credibility. And I sit on a board for the Citizens Advisory Board for Police and Community Relations. And, one of the things that we hear consistently from the police department is that I think SDSU recently did an evaluation of policing statistics and data in San Diego, which clearly demonstrated a significant bias and disparate impact on communities of color. And even though this had been done by a very legitimized academic institution, the system of the police department continue to disavow the value of the findings and the data. And so I know while that's not specifically health related, it deals with the impact of stressors in our community that can then relate to health issues. And I'm wondering, how do you face that challenge when things are documented in academic spaces and then still invalidated as a source of information that represents, hey, this is legitimate?
That example right there is what worries me about systems, because we've been telling you this. We have been telling you, we have been telling you, we have been telling you. Now it's fact. Somebody listened to us, they put it in a book, and y'all still say it's not true. So at this point, you have to call a spade and figure out how you are going to work around this issue as best you can, because you have to keep flowing like water. You have to keep going, because they're gonna, I'm censoring myself. You have to keep going. You have to keep going, even though the facts are there and even though they're ignoring the facts, that doesn't stop our experience. So we have to do what we always do and become innovative and figure out different ways to solve the same problem, because the problem is always going to morph, but we are going to survive because we always have.
Hi, I am a USD alum and I now teach and live in Sacramento. And I have a question about food deserts, which is something that Dr. Fuller brought up earlier. Sacramento is known as the farm to fork capital. However, only about 2% of the food grown here is consumed. And I live and teach in an area that's considered a food desert. Most of my students receive free and reduced lunch. However, I do and am concerned about them getting dinner. And as has been expressed here already, I also distrust systems. Most of our food banks are located in primarily white communities, and even transportation, it's difficult to get to healthy and affordable food grocery stores. However, I have trust in a lot of mutual aid projects that are going on in the community, as well as like urban farming projects in collaboration with local high schools. So my concern though is, are those programs, do you think, scalable to address such a pervasive issue?
The American Academy of Pediatrics has suggested that those of us who are in pediatric healthcare build relationships in our practices with places where you can get inexpensive produce. So you may have heard of Dr. Hannah Tishi, who is well known for the Flint lead crisis, but their practice, which is out of her pediatric practice, they actually rebuilt the facility and put a farmer's market underneath it so they could give people a prescription. So I think that there are lots of ideas and things that we can think about, ways to address the food desert. I know in City Heights, there are many urban farms and people in their sort of community, but I think that one of the things with community-based is that's a very good, if you come up this way, we can make a better difference, I think, in how people are doing things. I mean, we can make a better impact. I mean, we have this problem that we have federal programs like WIC, which give you vouchers, but they also kind of give you vouchers for things that really help the farmers, the dairy farmers, really. We've got a lot of milk. I mean, basically that's, they're trying to address certain conditions, but I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think they are potentially scalable, but they may be scalable differently because what's the need and where you are is going to be different than City Heights, is going to be different than in Fresno. It's going to be different than in the Imperial Valley.
I kind of piggyback on what Dr. Fuller's saying with the local efforts. I'm more inclined to support the small local efforts, but if, as you're describing a community, you still have to go to a white community that might be inaccessible. It's not local enough, right? And so I guess I would say, what does the scaling up look like? Maybe it's scaling this way, scaling out as opposed to up, and making something bigger and quote unquote more efficient, but making it more local, and in some ways making it smaller might be the better solution. I mean, I grew up in Sacramento. I've been seeing things, like vending machines popping up, or refrigerators that have been like refashioned so that people can get like really truly free food. And so we have one here in San Diego, I think in North Park. So kind of a little library kind of setup, but with food items. And so I think there are those things, those smaller things make me a little bit more hopeful than seeing a kind of a diffusion of it, if that makes sense. I really want to thank Dr. Robinson for asking me to, do this panel. And I really am appreciative to my panelists, my fellow panelists for coming. They were fantastic last semester, and so I knew we had to hear from them again. So thank you, Dr. Fuller, Dr. Hall, and Dr. Talley, and thanks for all of you for attending and joining us and talking about a difficult topic, but important one.